How often do you bring your landscape photographs into Photoshop? I've always been a hardcore Lightroom user. The photographer-centric workflows helped coach me into focusing on global adjustments and shooting the best image I could on location. However, last year I set a goal to do more composite photography, especially astrophotography. A composite is a photograph made from several exposures blended together, usually of the same subject, but from different times of day. After scouting the location and choosing a composition, your tripod is often going to stay put for golden hour, sunset, blue hour, and maybe even astronomical twilight. Now, it takes a lot of patience to risk 3 to 6 hours on one composition, but it will truly take your photography to the next level. So in the next few vlogs, we'll cover the steps to creating an astrophotography composite from 3 exposures. We'll cover how to merge the raw images, alignment, luminosity masking, refining the selections, and then how to finish up the composite in Lightroom. Today, we're going to start by combining the candidate exposures into one and align them. I'll be using a shot from Sparks Lake in Oregon that I took earlier this year. By the time we finish this series, the blended composite will look like this. Our first step is to identify the 3 pieces of this composite photograph. I've already stacked together the 3 different exposures that I'll be using. This first one is going to be my base exposure. This is from Blue Hour, when you get the beautiful, cool colors in the midground and a little bit in the background. But the foreground is way too dark and the sky has no stars in it. So this is just my base exposure, but I took 2 other exposures. This shot was taken earlier in the day around golden hour. And although it looks a little bit overblown and the water looks awful, here in the foreground, we have these bushes, which are my foreground. So this exposure is for my foreground. And then finally, the last exposure is taken way into astronomical twilight. And it's a little bit difficult to see without any processing, but we have these beautiful star trails that I'll be able to layer in to the composite. So 3 photographs, 1 for the foreground, 1 for the midground, and 1 for the background. So now that we have identified the 3 exposures we want to blend together, we need to get these into Photoshop. Lightroom can do a lot of things like merging together panos or high dynamic range images, but it can't merge together completely different images from completely different times of day. That's where we have to step in with Photoshop. So I'm going to grab these 3 photos and I'm going to go to the the Edit In menu, and I want to edit these in Photoshop. However, when this normally opens up in Photoshop, it's not going to make it easy for me to embed these documents, so I want to come down to this last option, Open as Smart Object. What this will do is this will open up 3 separate Photoshop documents with these raw images. These are DNGs, digital negatives. I want to open these as smart objects. That'll make it easier for me to do non-destructive editing. So if I need to make changes to any one of these composites later on, it'll be much easier to do. So a minute or so later, you should have all 3 images loaded up, and what you'll notice is that over here in the Layers panel, there should be a little icon next to your image. That indicates that it's a smart object. If these weren't smart objects, we wouldn't get some of the benefits we'll need later on to make non-destructive edits. Now, you need to pick whichever one of these photographs you consider to be your base exposure. One way to think about this is to pick whichever photo has most of what you want to keep. Now, that's a little bit tricky in this image because I'm actually going to be replacing so much of the foreground and so much of the background with the other 2 composites. But another way to think of this is when you go to publish the photo, which image's metadata do you want to show? In this case, I'm going to make the Blue Hour photo my base exposure. This is going to be the document that I end up saving. On these other 2, I really just want to transfer the Smart Object layer over. So I'm going to come up here to the menu and hit Duplicate Layer, and usually if you go to just the top option in the menu, that's going to copy it over to the image that's farthest on the left over here. So I'm going to hit OK and close the second tab. And now you'll notice we're back at the first tab, but now it has 2 layers. We have the layer we just copied over and then the base exposure of Blue Hour below that. Let's do that once more with our last image in the composite. I'm going to right click on it and hit Duplicate Layer. And I'm just going to select the top option here for the destination and then close this tab out and not save changes. At the end of the day, you should end up with one Photoshop document with 3 layers. The bottom one is going to be Blue Hour, the middle one is going to be these bushes, and the top one is going to be my star trails. You can go ahead and save the document. It may take a moment. On my machine, this document is already up to 1.5 gigabytes. So these files are gigantic. So it can be kind of difficult to work with these files, so it's important to not make a ton of these or to clean up after yourself if you repeat this process. Now, if we flip on and off some of these layers, you'll notice that they're not perfectly aligned. Although the star trails in Blue Hour are pretty close, although they move a little bit, the bushes are completely different. And this is because when I shot this image, I actually moved the camera just a little bit. I left the tripod in place, but I went to snap another photo and brought the camera right back. Unfortunately, I had changed my focal distance. So because of that, there is a little bit of change. And even between the star trails and the Blue Hour, there's a little bit of shift, which you'll be able to see when we zoom in here. There's maybe about 10 pixels or so difference. Photoshop does have an auto-align layers method, but that only works with rasterized layers. We don't want to rasterize anything because that's going to limit our ability to come back and non-destructively make changes. So that means we're going to have to manually align these things, but not to worry, it's pretty easy to do. I'm going to start with aligning the star trails. Now, it's important to remember which one of these exposures you consider to be your base exposure. This bottom layer for Blue Hour is not going to move. I'm not going to make any changes to it. I'm not going to mask it. I'm not going to tweak it or move it. Star trails, on the other hand, is going to be moved. So what I want to do is see when I've lined it up. Now, that can be a little bit difficult to see since it completely obscures the layer under it. So I like to change the blend mode from normal to different, which is down here in the menu. This will give you this amazing visualization where you can very easily see if things are lined up or not. Now, when you look at this at a glance, we see that overall it's shifted horizontally. So I'm going to hit Command T for transform and try to just move things over. Now, it's important to note that by default, Photoshop has some snapping grids set up. So I recommend going up to the menu, go to View, Snap To, and select None if it isn't already selected. This will keep Photoshop from trying to snap your selection around, and it'll let you have some very fine tweaking. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to try to shift this over a little bit to the left. We're trying to get those edges to disappear. So if I shift it down a little bit, right about there. So now the mountains look well aligned, but if you go over here to the far left, you'll notice that the tree line doesn't look quite right. If I scroll down here a little bit, we're pretty close overall. So I'm actually just about happy with this. So I recommend checking the extreme corners of the image to see how well aligned it is. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to get it to within a few pixels. It's going to make your job a lot easier. If you don't do this alignment process, you're going to have much more work to do later on. Overall, I'm really happy with how it is. Because this is a smart object and these adjustments do not get rasterized, you can hit return and commit that transform and come back later and still make changes non-destructively. If you flip the layer on and off, you can take a quick look and see just how well aligned it is. I'm going to come down here to the bushes. The bushes don't matter in this particular image because this is the exposure for the star, so I would focus on these mountain ridges and see how close they are. Very often, however, if they don't get quite close enough, you might have to pull out some bigger tools. Let me change the merge mode from difference back to normal, and now we'll tackle the hardest one, bushes. This was the golden hour exposure. When I flip it on and off, if we zoom out, we'll see that not only is it a move adjustment, it is a zoom adjustment. So this is going to be quite a bit more maneuvering, but still not too bad. First off, I'm going to change this to difference so we can visualize our changes. And we'll see that these are really far off. So I'm going to hit Command T while the bushes layer is selected. And I just want to make this layer a little bit bigger. I want to zoom in to line it up with my base exposure. So I recommend holding down Option and Shift so that way it will do a true zoom in without changing the aspect ratio. And we want to get this as close as possible. It'll take a little trial and error to get it close. So right about there is pretty close. You probably won't get it exact. It's really important to note that because you're dealing with zoom, which introduces a different kind of lens correction, even if you have a rectilinear lens, there's going to be some lens distortion. So it's really important to note that you'll not be likely to get these exactly lined up. So it's important just to get them as close as possible. You'll notice, for example, over here on the left, this mountain range is not lining up. So I'm going to try to line this up a little bit, but without holding down the Shift key. So that means I'm going to skew the aspect ratio just a little bit. And over here, I've still got a little ghost. Let's move that over a little bit. Cool, we're about lined up. I'll nudge it up a pixel. We're pretty good on the mountain range, but this exposure is for the bushes. So we really need to get this really well lined up on the foreground. Now, unfortunately, this area is a little bit busy, so it's difficult to see those edges. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the return key to commit this transform and flick it on and off and see how close I am. I am really close. I'm actually close enough. I think I'm happy with this. Let me come over here to the right and double check. Yeah, I think overall this is close enough. If you needed to do, you can see it's like a pixel or two off. If you needed to do a little bit more nudging, when you hit Command T, you can hold down the Command key and grab any one of these corners to do a freeform 4-point transform. So I'll just demonstrate that. While holding down the Command key, you can click on any one of these corners and do some very powerful 4-point manipulations. This will let you line up pretty much anything, even if there was a perspective change or you rotated the tripod just a little bit. That said, lens correction is very difficult to work with, so you may not be able to get them perfectly lined up. But this is surprisingly close, so I'll hit return to commit my changes and change this back to normal mode. If I flip between the layers, I have the base layer, I have my foreground layer, and then I have the star trails, and they're all pretty well aligned. It's definitely good enough for us to proceed. Now, I mentioned earlier that I prefer not to do a lot of post-processing in Photoshop. That's because I personally think better in Lightroom, and I like the snapshot feature and a bunch of other things that Lightroom does really well. However, in Photoshop, it is important to do a few adjustments that will make the luminosity masking process later on a little bit easier. First off, I recommend going to each of these layers and turning on certain types of distortion corrections. So to do this, you can double click on the icon for any one of these layers and open up the raw image that we embedded as a smart object. We can open this up in Adobe Camera Raw. I make very few adjustments here, but I do recommend going over here to the lens correction and always turn on remove chromatic aberration. If you don't do this, you'll have a lot of difficulty merging the layers together because you'll have the color channels slightly out of alignment, especially with cheaper lenses, which means you're going to be aligning not really the images, but the individual channels. No reason not to come up here, turn on remove chromatic aberration. I also like to come to the detail panel and do a little bit more color correction, especially if one of my exposures is high noise. I do not recommend turning on any sharpening. It is going to unnecessarily add extra noise that you're just going to have to clean up after you do the composite. So again, think of this process in Photoshop as trying to create the base composite image before you do any post-processing you would normally do on a negative. You'll want to do this to every single layer, and these layers don't yet need to mesh with each other stylistically. In fact, they're going to be completely different white balances, different exposures, but because we've embedded these as smart objects, they'll be editable from now on. Once you've saved your changes, this will show up in Lightroom, and we'll be ready for next week's vlog. In next week's vlog, what we'll do is we'll finally make a selection and start cutting in the different regions of this photograph. So that way we have the base layer for the midground, we have the bushes from Golden Hour, and then finally we have those star trails at the top. That's all for this week's vlog though, so make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with the latest digital nomad tips, landscape photography tutorials, and on-location vlogs.